So it was August of 2005. I was the ripe young age of 19, and I stepped out and made the decision that all young men and women need to make, but all parents dread. I moved out of my childhood home and went away to dorm and study in college. Now, I don't know if you all have experienced that. Many of us have, where you venture away from your family of origin, from your community, from maybe your hometown, from your city. Whatever that took, whatever form that was for you, you left your family of origin, or you left the people that knew you and saw you grow up. And you grew and you changed and you developed. You weren't the same person that you were before you left. But then you come back and your grandma still treats you like you're 5. Or your dad still treats you like you're a teenager, even though you're in your 30s or your 40s or your 50s, right? How many of you have had that experience? You've had that feeling of where people had a perception of you that they were never really able to let go of. And how frustrating it was for you that perception was actually a misconception, right? Someone's saying yes. You say amen to that, that's fine. Now, it's one thing for grandma or dad to treat you like you're younger than you are. It's another thing entirely for somebody to draw some type of misconception, not just about you, but about your faith. What do we do when people carry a misconception of Jesus, of Christianity, of the Scriptures, of the things that are deeply important to us? And what do we do when those misperceptions lead them to reject Jesus, or perhaps even reject us? So we're going to look at some of those today. And to get things started, I just want to do a quick poll with those we have here this morning. Just raise your hand if you've heard some of these misconceptions. They're common, they're misconceptions, but they're very commonplace in the culture. Christians only care about political power. Anyone hear that one? Okay. Christians are anti-science. Okay? Everyone's heard that one. Christians hate LGBTQ people. Okay? Jesus would affirm my lifestyle choices. Okay. The Bible promotes genocide, and we'll add misogyny to that. Genocide and misogyny, the Bible promotes these things. Okay. All churches care about is money. Okay. Yes, we've all heard that one. So this doesn't cover the full gamut of misconceptions, but these are some of the big ones. Now, to be fair, some people believe these things because the behaviors of Christians have kind of reinforced them, or their beliefs were shaped by the decisions that some Christians made. But what happens is the choices, the decisions of some Christians leads people to form conclusions of all Christians. And so we have these misconceptions. So what do we do when these misconceptions linger in the people that we love and we desperately want them to see come to Jesus? Well, if we want to know what to do as followers of Jesus, we ought to look to what Jesus did. So we're going to be in Mark chapter 6 this morning. Mark 6 is Mark in general is this action-filled narrative of Jesus' life. And Mark 6, there's this very interesting experience that happens here. And now in Mark 5, we find Jesus coming out of the city of Capernaum. And now Capernaum was this place that Jesus frequented in his ministry. He went there quite often. And in Capernaum, if you were here last week, we talked about this. He heals this woman with a bleeding disorder, and he raises this little girl from the dead. So 2 rather significant events that take place in Jesus' life. And Jesus is teaching in the synagogues in Capernaum. So Jesus is doing all of these things, teaching, performing miracles, all of this stuff. But for the first time in Jesus' ministry, he is entering into his hometown of Nazareth. So, all the stuff that Jesus had done in these neighboring cities, not everybody had received Jesus, but there are people who are at least receptive to Jesus' ministry. And so we would assume maybe that if Jesus began talking and preaching with authority in his hometown, he would get the same sort of reception that he'd received elsewhere. But these are the folks who watched Jesus grow up. These are the folks that knew things about Jesus' family background. These were the folks who had heard rumors about the infidelity of Mary and perhaps even believed them, right? So would they be receptive to Jesus' ministry? That's the question. Because how they perceived Jesus would determine whether or not they would receive Jesus, right? How they perceived Jesus determined whether they would receive Jesus. And you know as well as I do that when you form conclusions about somebody, it can be very hard to live outside of that and step outside of those perceptions. So, Mark 6, starting in verse 1, here's how it reads. If you have a Bible, follow along here with me. He went away from there and came to his hometown. He's leaving Capernaum into Nazareth, right? And his disciples followed him. And on the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogues, and many who heard were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? How are such mighty works done by his hands?" Now, the interesting thing about Mark is that he leaves a lot of stuff out. So we don't have the details of what Jesus had taught specifically in the book of Mark. We know that he taught, though. Now we find from the Gospel of Luke, we find that Jesus opens up the scroll of Isaiah. And if you don't know who Isaiah is the messianic prophet. He foreshadowed the coming of Jesus 700 years before Jesus came. And he reads the scroll of Isaiah. And he essentially tells the people on no uncertain terms that he is the Messiah that was prophesied by him. And so people are hearing this story being read, this prophecy being read, and Jesus says, "This is me." And they're wondering, where is he getting these teachings? Where is this stuff coming from? And it says they were astonished. Now, this word can mean they're amazed. They have this sense of awe about them when Jesus is talking. But it could also mean something else. It can mean that they are in a state of panic or shock. And given the context, I would say that it's the latter. Because it says in verse 3, "Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon, and are not his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. So people had some ideas about who Jesus was. Ideas that weren't accurate. Ideas that weren't true. And we could rest assured that if they formed these sorts of conclusions about Jesus, people today will form those sorts of conclusions about those of us who follow Jesus. Now, did they form their conclusions on the fact that Jesus spoke with wisdom? No. The legitimacy of the miracles that he had done? No. The fact that he just exuded love and compassion in everything that he had done? No. No. What formed their conclusion of Jesus was something else. It says they took offense. The word in the original Greek is skandalizo, and it means where we get our word scandal, right? Scandalized. And it just means simply to cause to stumble, to cause to sin, to cause to become indignant, to shock, and to offend, right? We find they're offended, and they said, "This is the carpenter," right? This is Mary's son. They're scandalized by what Jesus is doing, the fact that he's just this lowly carpenter, and the fact that he's the son of Mary. We find that Joseph isn't mentioned in this passage at all. Some scholars think that it's because Joseph had already died at this point, but I think Mark's exclusion of Joseph is actually theologically strategic, Because he's not Joseph's son, is he? He's Mary's son. He's definitely God's son. Mark 1, verse 11, the Father says, "This is my son." Nevertheless, Joseph treated Jesus like a son, but he's not his biological son. He's Mary's son. And they say, this guy is the one who is teaching us the things of God. The carpenter, the illegitimate child of Mary. That's what's at play here in this particular moment. Right? But what's also true is that culturally, they didn't have like we do. They didn't have this concept of upward mobility, that if you work hard enough and long enough and you get the right education, you can sort of actually change people's perceptions of you over time. There was no concept of upward mobility in Jesus' day. If you were born into a blacksmith family, you were a blacksmith, you stayed a blacksmith, right? If you were born into a carpenter's family, you were a carpenter, you usually stayed a carpenter. Now, you could become a rabbi, and if you met the cut of becoming a rabbi, there was a possibility you can get out that way. But most times, if your life had a humble beginning, it had a humble middle, and it had a humble end to it. So even though Jesus displayed power and authority that could only come from God, they could not accept that Jesus had come from God. In their mind, this is just not how God works. God wouldn't come through a carpenter. God wouldn't come through this illegitimate child. And so they rejected Jesus' ministry because they found it offensive. And in verse 4, it reads, "And Jesus said to them, 'A prophet is not without honor, except in his hometown, among his relatives, and in his own household.'" Okay? This is a callback to Mark chapter 3, where Jesus talks about how he's forming a new family that isn't based in biology, that's not based in blood, but it's based in faith and obedience to God. But he recognized that because of their misconceptions about him, the perceptions they've decided they're going to believe about Jesus, they would not receive his ministry. They would reject his ministry. But what we find as we go later on into this passage, as we read, that this doesn't deter Jesus' ministry at all. And what I want to do is I want to stop here for a moment, because I think we can allow people's perceptions of us a little too much authority in our life. I think we can. How often do we allow someone's negative response to us, whether it's an invitation to come to church, or we're just sharing our story about what God's done in our life, and maybe someone responds with indifference, or someone says something to say about, this is how the church hurt me and wronged me, so I can never believe those sorts of things. How often do we allow somebody's perceptions and how they respond based on their perceptions of the church and of Jesus to determine our future obedience to Jesus? Oftentimes we do. And so we say, you know what, I'm just going to stop. I'm just going to leave sharing Jesus to the professionals. And I'm just going to sit back. I'm going to come to church. I'm going to sing the songs. I'm going to listen to the message. And then I'm just going to go on my merry way. That's a real temptation. I think some of us can get caught up in that. But I also think we can get caught up in something else that I think is equally as dangerous. That we can continue to try to reach those people. But instead what we do, listen to me carefully, we try to accommodate to their misconceptions rather than holding fast to the truth of who Jesus is. And we accommodate so that we don't offend people. There's a strong cultural current towards compromise. It's easy for us to get sucked up in. And look, I get it. Life would be so much easier if Jesus didn't say hard things about money, hard things about sex and marriage, hard things about what we do with people that we can't stand. But the thing is, I don't find a sound basis in the Bible for followers of Jesus to accommodate to the outside world, to the culture. I find a place for cultural relevance, how we share the gospel, absolutely. But I don't see anything that makes place for cultural accommodation. Now, we shouldn't be jerks. Let me be clear on that. John 13, Jesus says to his disciples, "They will know you are my disciples by your love for one another." The first and greatest commandment, and the second, Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. Our love for one another in this place and how we extend that love to those outside of this place is absolutely paramount. But we've confused being loving with being inoffensive. We've confused with being loving with being inoffensive. Okay? Now, being inoffensive isn't necessarily being loving. It just means you're inoffensive. Let me give you an example. If you were to ask me on any given day, how many times today have you offended your children? I'd tell you I lost count. Okay? Right? Sometimes it's 10 times in an hour. Okay? Now, I'll get a little bit more specific with you. Yesterday, my son and I, we had some time together. My wife took our daughter to Fantasy Island. It's called something else now that I forgot the name of. But it was just my son and I. We were in the backyard, and he has this little sand table that he likes to play in. And oftentimes what will happen is he'll be playing with the sand, and I'll be doing something in the yard, and I'll turn around, and I'll notice that he is eating the sand. And it's abundantly clear that he's eating the sand because the sand is green, and I'll see little green particles around his mouth. And if he's a little less subtle about it, I won't see it around his mouth, but when he opens his mouth, I see it in it. Okay? And so that happened yesterday, and I saw the green particles on his face, and I said, Have you been eating sand? He looks at me. I said, you have. Keep eating sand. I'm going to take the sand table away. Well, he continues to do it. Take the sand table away, and I take him elsewhere. And he was not happy with that arrangement. He did not like it. He was offended by it, okay? I can't tell you how many times I've had that conversation with my son, and every single time he's offended. Every single time, all right? Now, would any of you argue that I am being unloving by offending my son, telling him not to eat sand? Of course not. Of course not. But for some reason, when we enter into adulthood, all of a sudden we think we've got the market cornered on the truth. We've got it all figured out. And that if you say something that's offensive to me, it is automatically false. How's that work? Right? Just because it's offensive to me or offensive to you, offensive to somebody else, doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't true. It just means that I'm offended, right? Being loving does not mean surrendering to the culture's misconceptions of Jesus. It just means surrendering to Jesus. Because if you look at Jesus' response to the people in his hometown, it's amazing. He doesn't accommodate at all. He doesn't say, okay, guys, let's talk about this. My teaching's about money. I know that's a little hard for you guys. That's a little challenging for you, so I'm just not going to teach about that anymore, okay? Or I know, love and hate, my teachings on that are kind of challenging, and how I talk about hate being the equivalent of murder, so I'm just not going to talk about that. And I know that whole concept of taking up your cross and following me daily is kind of a lot, so what if you took up your cross quarterly, or monthly, or annually? Would you follow me then? He doesn't do that. He just very matter-of-factly responds, prophet is not without honor except in his hometown. He recognized people were offended, but it didn't shock him. It didn't confuse him. It didn't frustrate him even. So if someone finds Jesus to be offensive, it should probably go without saying that they might find us to be offensive as well. But you don't need to be respected or liked or admired by everybody in order to be used by God. I think more believers need to know and hear that and believe that today. We've confused being loving with being inoffensive, and we need to change that. All right, in verse 5, it reads like this: "And he could do no mighty work there in his hometown, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people." Now, we might look at this passage and we might think to ourselves that Jesus' power was limited by people's response. Like their response somehow hampered Jesus' ability to do something. I don't think that's what this is saying at all. I think Jesus limited his own power when people responded the way that they did, right? I think that's what's happening here. And the context of this passage is about Jesus' desire to be reconciled to people. But he will not pursue reconciliation with people who outright reject him. He did a few miracles. He healed a few people. But even then, the people in his hometown were absolutely unmoved by what Jesus did. Okay? They didn't believe Jesus was from God. And whether we like it or not, we're going to have people that are just not receptive to what we have to say as followers of Jesus. And we need to learn to be okay with that. I've served as a chaplain for many years. I still do. I go to various work sites in the Buffalo area and get to know some of the male workers there and build relationship with them. And there was a site that I was serving in several years back that had one employee working there, real nice guy, but he was an atheist. And we've had lots of conversations over the months. And one time we started talking about belief, about faith. And I asked him what he believed. And he said that, the Bible is just the stuff of myth, and Jesus, his divinity, it was just some sort of ancient telephone game that over time they just made Jesus divine, that he isn't actually God. And then I heard him, I listened to him, and then afterwards I said, okay, do you mind if I share with you what I believe? And I just shared my testimony with him, and I shared the logical reasons why I believe that it makes sense to believe in the resurrection of Jesus, and then after going through all of it, he said, yeah, I still don't believe it. And I asked him, I said, okay, what would it take for you to believe? What would need to happen? And he said, I don't know. It just all seems too unreal for me. Now, I'm convinced that this particular gentleman, God could have written, I exist in the sky, and it wouldn't have changed him, because he had already decided what he was going to believe about Jesus. What we believe about Jesus has an effect, to some extent, on what Jesus is able to do in our life. God honors human choice, not because he doesn't have the power to do things in our life, but because he honors our decisions to reject him. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Because his goal isn't merely to do a bunch of parlor tricks for people. His goal is relationship with those who are made in his image. That is Jesus' goal. And so for us as Christians, our job is not to just earn the respect and admiration of people. It's to love them, and it's to point them to Jesus. It's to love them and to point them to Jesus. So don't let someone's rejection of you determine your devotion to Jesus. Don't let someone's rejection of you determine your devotion to Jesus. Because truth is, they may not be rejecting you. They may very well be rejecting the light of Christ in you. Verse 6, listen to what happens next. This is something we never want to be true of us. And he marveled because of their unbelief. And he went about among the villages teaching. There are two moments where Jesus marvels in the Gospels. Right, one is the faith of a Roman centurion. He says, I have not seen faith like this in all of Israel. And then there's this one where he marvels over the unbelief of people who are in his hometown. I want Jesus to marvel over my faith, not my unbelief, right? But he realizes that in this moment, his work here is done. And he doesn't chase after people. He doesn't try to convince them to follow him. He doesn't give out one last sales pitch to try to convince a couple of holdouts, because he knows their hearts. He knows who they are. He knows they've made this decision to reject him, and he's moved on. He doesn't stop anymore. He goes to the next towns and villages that will receive him. Verse 7. And this is where it shifts from Jesus' ministry to the disciples' ministry. Listen to this. And he called the 12 and began to send them out 2 by 2 and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics. So Jesus wanted his disciples to have enough for their journey, but not so much that they were depending on their material possessions, right? He wanted to nurture in them a sense of obedience, a sense of dependency upon God. He says, I want you to trust your heavenly Father more than you trust your earthly resources. That's what he's telling them here. Now, I'm going to be very candid with all of us here today. I think I can be. One of the reasons why we don't share our faith with people is because we adopt this mindset of scarcity. That we think, I don't have enough. I don't have enough biblical knowledge. I don't have enough education. I haven't been following Jesus long enough. Or I'm not good enough, holy enough, sanctified enough to share Jesus with people. Trust me, more education, more training, more biblical study, all of those things are good, and all of those things are necessary. Don't get me wrong. But those things alone will not change how you think. They won't. Even after going into seminary, I still struggled with feelings like I wasn't prepared enough for what God wanted me to do. But if you look, Jesus gives the disciples the authority to do what he did. So the same power that indwelt Jesus in his earthly ministry, the same power that raised Jesus from the dead, the same power that fueled the early church is the same power that lives in you if you've chosen to follow Jesus with your whole life. The question is, do we trust him? Of course, we should be equipped to share Jesus in an ever-changing culture. Don't get me wrong. Jesus says to his disciples, take what you need for the journey, but not beyond that. So there's a point where with the biblical knowledge we have, with the experience we have, with the training we have, we say, you know what? I'm going to step out in faith, and I'm going to trust God. Because the truth is, many Christians say they trust God, but their actions demonstrate otherwise. Now listen to Jesus' instructions to them. He says this, and he said to them, whenever you enter a house, stay there until you depart from there. And if any place will not receive you, and they will not listen to you, when you leave, shake the dust that is on your feet as a testimony against them. So they went out and proclaimed that people should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many who were sick and healed them. Now, I want us to notice something really important about this passage here. First off, the section where Jesus goes into his hometown to do ministry, he's rejected, and then he's essentially preparing the disciples for what will happen when they get rejected. That they're going to experience what he himself has experienced. And notice it says, many who were sick were healed. Many demons were cast out. Not all. Not all. I think that's a really important distinction because in the same way, not all people were receptive to Jesus, not all people were receptive to the disciples, and not all people will be receptive to what we have to say as believers. And it doesn't matter whether you are in the first century of Israel or whether you're in 21st century America today. I believe, and this is my perspective, this may not be exhaustive, but I think there's some truth here. I think there are three responses that we're going to find when we share Jesus with people. And the first is, of course, the one that we've talked about. The response of offense. If people are offended by Jesus, they'll be offended by you. Now, there are those of us who are, maybe a little bit weird and we enjoy conflict. All right, so I want to take a moment to address those of you who like conflict with other people. I want us to be reminded that our goal isn't to be offensive, it's to be faithful to Jesus. Right? Our goal isn't to be offensive, but to be faithful to Jesus. If people are offended by the gospel, we still have the responsibility of living faithfully, forgiving those who mistreat us, loving our enemies, praying for those who persecute us and say all sorts of terrible things about us. We make fidelity to Christ our goal, not offending people our goal. Because if we offend people, what we're going to do is we're just going to nurture their worst impulses. Don't make being offensive your goal. Now, as you know, last month was Pride Month. And if you're on Facebook or Instagram, you saw a lot of people posting positively or negatively about Pride Month. I saw either extreme. I saw maybe some Christians who were posting some things that were perhaps right, but posting on social media really wasn't the right context for it. Because all it did was fuel offense. All it did was generate heat instead of light. So we need to be careful. We may offend, yes, but let's not make offending the goal. And let's check our hearts before we make any sort of action. Okay? But the truth is we might offend people with the gospel, even if we're as loving and as gentle and as kind as we possibly can be. Years ago, I was pastoring a church in the South Towns, and there was a family in the church whose grandparent had passed away. And I was asked to do the funeral. They did everything in the funeral home itself. And you know how they have those rooms off to the side that's separate from where the body's laid out? Right? So there was a bunch of people there, and I was spending some time talking with them. And there was one girl there. She was in her early 20s. She was talking with me. It began kind of casual. But then the conversation began to move towards what she believed. And she did not believe in Jesus. She believed in a higher power, but she believed in a lot of New Age type stuff. And she shared it. I listened. And then I shared with her a little bit about what I believe. And while I'm sharing with her, I'm just sharing the gospel with her. I'm not being pushy or being preachy at all. I start to hear something. It sounds like a plane, like the jet of a plane. It sounds like maybe, like a rumble of thunder. And then it's getting louder and louder and louder. And I'm like, what is this sound that I'm hearing? And then I figure it's not outside, it's inside. And it was growling. And I'm looking around for a dog. I don't see a dog. And I look, the woman I'm talking to is stone-faced, furrowed brow. She's growling at me. She's growling at me just for sharing the gospel. True story. I politely walked away. Okay? So just saying that might happen to you, I don't know. Yeah. So you might not start by offending someone, though, but in the conversation, you might end up offending someone, right? But just be prepared for unusual responses because you might get one, all right? So there's offense. That's the first thing that we experience, and we shouldn't be surprised by that. The second is what we call persecution. And now, I'm very hesitant to use this particular word because in Christian circles, we can sort of play fast and loose with this word, right? Like people say like they're being persecuted when somebody says something mean about them. I don't think that's persecution. Like the disciples, like the early Christians, followers of Jesus, like they were lit on fire and used as tiki torches for Emperor Nero's garden parties. Like that's persecution, right? So there's a level of persecution that we need to understand. It's oftentimes distinct from what we would call persecution today. But historically, the message of Christianity was not warmly received by the outside culture. It was rejected by the culture. Now, we got to experience a period of time in our country where Christian morals and ideas were dominant. For many, many years, for decades. We're in an age where that is increasingly not the case. So we're moving back into a day where there will be more hostility, more anger, more offense, which will lead to some type of persecution to those who follow Jesus. And I don't mean physical persecution, but I do think we're in an age where we will increasingly experience more ideological persecution. Ideological persecution, right? So, where we're being pressured to hold a certain worldview on morals, on sexuality, on gender, even our political worldview, there's more and more pressure from our culture to adopt that, to capitulate, or get canceled, get rejected, right? How many people today see Christians as intolerant bigots? I never thought we would live in a day where that was the case in our country, but here we are. Even saying Jesus is the only way to salvation is a point of controversy that can court persecution. There's another funeral that I did where something happened. Maybe I should not do funerals anymore, I don't know. But it was a tragic story. This young man died from a drug overdose. It was very, very sad. But you have to take in, the family's grieving, they're hurting, and they're in pain. You have to be very sensitive with the words you choose. And so I sat down, I met with the family beforehand, and I said to them, hey, this is what I'm planning to do. This is the direction I want to take. Are you comfortable with me doing that? And they were good with it. And I gave them hope and encouragement. I tried to provide some sense of peace for them as best as I could. And then at the end of it, I just shared the hope of the gospel, the hope that we find in Jesus Christ. I made no mention about whether their son is in heaven or in hell. That is not the place to do that, right? But there's the hope that we have in Jesus, and that was the time to share the gospel. And I did. Well, let me just say this. It didn't quite go the way I'd planned. A little bit later, about a day or two later, the deceased's sister, his younger sister, sent me a message on Facebook. And essentially the message was, your message was terrible. How dare you say my brother is in hell? And I'm like, I looked over my notes and I'm like, did I say that? I'm like, no, didn't say that at all. But that was what was on her mind. And the truth was, she was hurting. She was in a lot of pain. She had experienced church hurt herself, and she had a severe drug addiction at the time. And so, what I had to come to understand is that whatever type of persecution that we might experience, it oftentimes comes from a place of incredible hurt and pain of the person who is persecuting. And part of seeing them as a human being and not dehumanizing them and just casting them as enemies and calling them evil is realizing, understanding that they are hurting and they're in pain, and that is what their response is coming from. And the third and the final response, of course, to sharing Jesus with somebody is belief. Right? I love Acts 17, verse 32, when Paul is sharing the gospel with the Athenians in the Areopagus. It says, "Now when they heard of the resurrection of the dead," so he talked about the resurrection of Jesus and then the hope of future resurrection, right? "Some mocked, but others said, 'We will hear you again about this.' And it says that some went on to believe. Not everybody is going to believe that you share the gospel with, but some actually will. There's a 2016 study that was put out that discovered close to half of unchurched Americans, 47%, say they would discuss freely if someone wants to talk about their religious beliefs. Now, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the other 53%, but 47% are at least willing to have the discussion with us if we're prepared to have the discussion with them. And what I will say about that too is this: more people are willing to listen to Christians publicly talk about their faith when they see Christians publicly live out their faith. Right? Oftentimes the hostility is because what Christians say they believe isn't what Christians demonstrate in their actions. So offense may come. It will come. Persecution may come. I believe it will come in some measure. But there are people who are more open and more willing to hearing the gospel than you might think. Like the very person that you think would not hear it could be the very first person that is most desperate to hear it and who needs it. But you don't need to be accepted or liked by everyone to be used by God. And what I find interesting about what Jesus instructs his disciples to do, I find it very interesting. He says to them, "Shake the dust off your feet and walk away." If people reject you, if people form some type of misconception about you and about the gospel, and they don't want to hear what you have to say because of it, shake the dust off your feet and walk away. Now, in the Jewish culture, what they would do is when they would enter Gentile regions, upon leaving them, they would shake the dust off their feet as a form of God's judgment towards them. Now, what's interesting is Jesus is telling his disciples to do that with fellow Jews. Right? Now, that sounds harsh, and we kind of get defensive when we talk about God's judgment, but think about this. This is essentially the disciples saying, "Look, I've done everything that I can. I shared the love and the grace and the hope that's found in Jesus with these people. And I'm recognizing that it is no longer in my hands. I'm entrusting it to God. I'm trusting this person, this family, these people that I love and may desperately want to come to Jesus. I'm trusting God with them." And that can be hard because our tendency is to want to say, all right, what can I do to get them to believe? What can I say to get them to believe? What can I do to convince them? And there could very well be a point where you just have to say, I'm going to shake the dust off my feet and I'm going to walk away. Because here's what's true. Their response is not your responsibility. Their response is not your responsibility. Your response to Jesus is your responsibility. Your response to Jesus is your responsibility. So the question isn't how many notches on my spiritual belt do I have because of the people that I've brought to faith in Christ. The question is, have I been faithful to Christ? And am I trusting in him for the results? Even when I'm met with offense or I'm met with persecution. And in those moments where I'm met with someone actually coming to faith and believing in the gospel. So I'm going to invite the worship team to come, and they're going to sing a final song for us today. They're going to do that as we just prepare our hearts for communion. You know, I look at the work that Jesus has done on the cross for you and for me, and we've experienced new life because of that. Now we're called on mission to give people opportunities to experience that same sort of hope that we have in Christ. And I don't know about you, but I have moments where I will share Jesus with people, and I'm not met with openness. I'm met with offense. I'm met with hostility. I'm met with negative responses because of that misconception people have of Christians and of Jesus. But I hope that when they see me, they see some semblance of Jesus, his self-sacrificial nature, his love, his kindness, the very thing that was demonstrated when Jesus died on the cross for you and for me, for all of our sins, past, present, and future.